Did you ever wonder why, in recent years, more and more people seem to be disappearing from our national parks, and at such a higher rate than ever before? While many see these occurrences as unexplainable or seem to think they have a reasonable, rational, or even scientific explanation for it all, there are some of us who know better, some of us who think otherwise. From UFO and Bigfoot sightings to the bizarre and unexplained missing 411 clusters, many of us are left scratching our heads and wondering what is going on out there in the woods. While there are many folk tales and legends into who or what is lurking out there in the woods and forests all around the world, today we're going to focus on one legend in particular, the legend of the FAE or fairy people. While most people seem to think of them as helpful, beautiful, and sparkly, if not a little bit mischievous, when thinking of fairies, there are others who have heard the real legends, the real terrifying and strange encounters with these mystical beings in the woods, and have had our visions of them forever changed because of it. Let's take a walk through the deepest, darkest parts of the forest and explain the shockingly terrifying world of the Fae. Could they be the real reason all these hikers and hunters and professionals, children and animals too, have gone missing at such an alarming rate all over the world? It's up to you to decide. Wherever you travel in the world, there's some kind of fairy legend. They differ from place to place, and quite unusually, there seems to be no single point of origin from where they came from or where the story started. In many cultures, it's believed that these tiny beings are actually demoted angels or even demons who lurk and hide in the woods and forest, ready to snatch unsuspecting victims out of our known place and time, dragging them to who knows where. There's also a strong belief for the need to ward them off using charms of protection, usually worn somewhere on the body. If you ever run into one of these beings, be sure not to mention it by name. More commonly, they are referred to as the little people or the hidden people, so as not to summon them unknowingly. So, the people who believe this legend of the fairies or the fae being fallen, whether angel or otherwise, believe they are neither good enough for heaven nor bad enough for hell below. They can appear and disappear at will, which makes it very easy for them to stalk and sneak up on their target. In 1962, in southern England, a farmer's wife reported getting lost in a very remote area of wilderness known to this day as the Berkshire Downs. She recalls how she didn't even realize she was losing her way and became very panicked and confused all of a sudden. She claims to have never switched course and headed the entire time in the same and correct direction towards where she originally intended to go. What she realized later on, though, was that she was actually moving further and further into more remote and desolate parts of the woods, away from any other form of civilization. Eventually, she got very tired and stopped for a few minutes. This is when she heard a sort of murmuring or mumbling coming from somewhere near her, although exactly where she couldn't be sure, as even though it was a clear and sunny day, she couldn't see anyone or anything to accompany the strange voice. Suddenly, as she sat there confused and trying to find the source of the small voice she thought she was hearing, a little person stepped out of the shadows of the woods and directly into her path. The bizarre thing here, though, the figure she describes as most likely male and dressed all in green appeared behind her, though somehow she claims she could see him and knew for a fact he was there. Without saying a word, the little man turned her around and pointed her to the right path back to her home. The figure then disappeared without a trace right before her eyes, and it was only while talking to her husband later on and recounting her bizarre and seemingly stress-induced experience did she realize she had encountered one of the Fae. Lucky for her, this was one of the helpful ones, and not the more commonly known ones who purposefully lure unsuspecting wanderers off their track and bring them to places unknown where they will never be able to find their way back. In Celtic lore, the Fae, or little people, are said to live underground, and any travelers who either knowingly or unknowingly trespass too near these hidden places are said to go missing and are never seen or heard from again. Many people who have had an encounter have reported to being in a place they had never seen or knew existed before, seemingly in the blink of an eye, with no knowledge or recollection of how they got there. Although this seemingly new place was definitely not where they were just a second ago, it still looked enough like where they had just been to make them question their own sanity. These places are familiar, yet unfamiliar, simply giving one an instinctual feeling that they are somewhere other. When they finally, and seemingly just as suddenly, return to where they had left from, always much more time has passed than they had anticipated. With what seemed to be like mere minutes had actually been hours or even days in some cases. Now, let's go to the United States and explore the early Native American legends of Mount Shasta. There were many complaints of even the earliest native settlers on and near this particular mountain of members of their tribe, specifically their hunting parties, who had vanished without a trace, never to be seen or heard from again. This happened so often, in fact, they started to believe the whole area was cursed. They also spoke of a bright stone which traversed the mountain and seemingly swallowed people whole. They were convinced that this stone had something to do with the fairies. Do you believe this area could be cursed? What was this glowing stone? Do you believe that stone has the ability to open up, swallow someone, and close back? Or do you believe this was just a scary story to tell their children in the hopes of keeping them from wandering too far on the mountain alone? On the other side of the world, in northern Sweden, there is a man who, for the sake of this video and out of respect for his desire to remain anonymous, we'll call Joe. Throughout his childhood, Joe would go to his grandparents' house in a deeply wooded area with lots of trees and trails for a young boy to explore. When he was 10 years old, he and his family went to stay at his grandparents' house for the entire summer. Aside from the one main house, there were several smaller cabins on the property, which his grandparents owned, and his family would stay together in these series of cabins for the entirety of their summer vacation. Joe stayed with a group of his cousins in a cabin that was a little less than 100 feet away from his grandparents' main house. This was extremely desolate land, and the closest town was miles and miles away. There was also a lake on the property, and Joe and his cousin's cabin was the closest one to it as well. There was electricity, but no running water, and the family had to collect their own, as going to the nearest town to buy some wasn't a reasonable option, as it would have taken so long for them to get there and return. While the lake was directly in front of Joe's cabin, behind it were very deep, very dark, and very desolate woods. Joe's grandfather would tell many stories to the family about alleged encounters he had had while in those woods, encounters which he didn't know how to explain, as there seemed to be no known words to describe what he was seeing and or experiencing. Joe himself said whenever he was hiking or just wandering around these woods, he always got this sort of creepy and eerie feeling, which he could never shake nor never explain. On numerous occasions, Joe reported seeing little people who would appear and then vanish just as quickly and seemingly without a trace. He claims that when these little people would cross the dirt paths, anyone nearby would freeze in place until they had gone. Now, when his cousin heard Joe telling other family members these experiences he was having, he decided that on the next hike he took with Joe, he would bring it up to joke and possibly tease him about. Obviously, he wasn't a believer. The cousin laughed and pretended to freeze in place while telling Joe it seemed he had come across one of the little people's trails. The boy's grandfather, however, wasn't very happy about this joke and reprimanded the other boy not to ever joke about the little people, especially not while wandering in the woods. The subject was eventually dropped, and they all went home to their respective cabins to retire for the night. In the middle of the night, however, Joe recalls being awakened by some sort of noise outside the cabin. The noise seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, all around the cabin, instead of just one singular place. He likened the noise to bears scratching at the outside of the cabin. It also sounded simultaneously like pebbles or giant raindrops were falling down onto the roof and running down the sides of the cabin. Suddenly, the scratching sounds seemed to be coming from under Joe and his cousin's beds. They were frozen in fear, frozen in place, if you will, with terror from the sound coming from right under where they were each respectively sitting. Eventually, they summoned the courage to get up and run as fast as they could to their grandparents' cabin to tell them what was going on. The next day, the two boys and their grandfather walked the same path in the woods as the day before, where their cousin had made the insult towards the little people, and they scattered candy all around and along the trails. As they did this, they profusely apologized for offending whatever it was in those woods that day and night. Joe thinks it was definitely the little people who had come to teach him and his cousin a lesson on manners and respect. Back in the United States in March of 1886, an Ohio newspaper article in the Bloomington Daily Leader came out involving a man and his daughter. This incident took place years before the article had come out, and the daughter's name is still unknown, while the man's name is Andy. We will call his daughter Sarah for the purpose of this story. Andy and Sarah were living in Dubuque County at the time. According to Andy, in her early teen years, his daughter started becoming sickly and ill all the time, and none of the doctors who examined or treated her seemed to be of any help. Whatever the illness was, it always seemed to return almost as quickly as it would leave. Because none of the physicians seemed to be able to figure out what was ailing her or how to cure it, Andy decided to take his daughter to a monastery and see a man named Father Bernard. Father Bernard was very well respected and considered very wise throughout the community, and upon hearing about Sarah's unexplainable illness, agreed to pray with the young girl. During one of their walks home from praying with Father Bernard, Sarah allegedly turned to her father and told him that it was all useless, that everything Father Bernard was doing wasn't going to help her, and eventually she would be taken by the FAE. Andy didn't pay attention at the time and thought his daughter was just feeling discouraged as she'd been sick for so long. About a year after she said this to him about the fairies, Sarah went missing. She seemed to have left everything behind and disappeared with only the clothes on her back. Searchers almost immediately dragged the creeks in the area and conducted foot searches deep into the neighboring woods for miles and miles, but no one ever found a single trace of Sarah. Because of the lack of any sign of her or evidence as to where she had gone, the locals and law enforcement set their sights on Andy as the culprit who had done something to his own daughter. However, luckily, before any charges were pressed against him, Sarah returned. The story she told as to what happened to her was unbelievable to most, and it's for you to decide now if you believe it or not. Sarah claimed that she had simply been traveling the country with the fairies the entire time she was gone. She recounted being in strange vehicles, invisible to the naked eye. The third day of her return, Sarah informed everyone that the FAE would soon be back for her and she would have to leave again with them. Indubitably, she left again not long after and was never seen or heard from again. The newspaper reported that Andy never changed his story about what had happened to his daughter, and when asked what he believed, he responded with the tales of the fairies from Ireland. Now, if you're thinking all of this talk of real fairies and the fae folk has started perhaps with the modern-day versions of fairy tales and people letting their imagination run wild, then maybe think again. Here's another story that takes place all the way back in the 16th century. This is an account of what allegedly happened to a woman named Anne Jeffreys. Anne was born in 1626 and passed away in 1698. There was a wealthy neighboring family named the Pitts who employed Anne as a domestic servant and were able and willing to verify all of Anne's accounts and claimed witness to some as well. Now let's travel back in time and hear the remarkable stories of Anne's encounters. Now, the documentation of these encounters came from a man named Moses Pitt, who wrote it all down and sent it to one Reverend Dr. Edward Fowler, who was the Bishop of Gloucester at the time of the strange occurrences. Moses was seeking the Reverend's advice on the matter. Let's hear what he has to say. In 1645, when Anne was just 19 years old, is when the unusual experiences are said to have started. Anne secured a job as a domestic servant for the wealthy Pitt family and started working in their home. While it's unclear exactly how long she'd been working for them at the time of this first encounter, we know it wasn't very long after she started. One morning, after Anne had finished up all her household chores, she went outside and sat in the garden of the huge estate home. Anne claims that, while sitting there silently, taking in the nice weather and relaxing on the comfortable arbor there in the backyard of that home, she heard someone or something in the woods very close to her. She said it sounded like someone was walking, very lightly, towards her. She first thought maybe it was one of the family members or maybe just a visitor to the home. She quickly disregarded this thought, however, when she began to hear strange ringing sounds, seemingly coming from every direction around her all at once. Although scared, Anne recalled that the day was so bright and beautiful, she also felt as though nothing could harm her. Also, she reasoned, there were people all around her, in the front of the house and inside as well, many witnesses, if you will. While the ringing was still going on, very loudly, and while Anne was trying to get her bearings, 6 small men, dressed all in green, suddenly appeared out of nowhere from the bright and sunny woods nearby. She described them as cute and charming looking, with big eyes and tiny little legs. She later started referring to them as fairies. Now, there's no information as to what made her use this particular title for a description, or what made her think this is what these little men in green were. Anne also claimed that upon laying her eyes on the men, she had become paralyzed or frozen in place, and after a minute or two she noticed a slight change in her environment before it changed altogether, and she saw the little men had brought her to what she called a castle in the sky. It is here where Anne claimed that these men had relations with her. The Pitt family verified that Anne did in fact go missing for that entire day, and though they searched far and wide, they never could locate her. Anne reappeared on her own, though, groggy, laying disheveled and in the fetal position on the lawn in the front yard. Anne kept quiet about her encounter for fear of being called insane or possibly even losing her job. However, she started speaking out and telling people her tale when she claims the little men, or fairies, started to return to her on occasion. This became her torment, and she started opening up to one member of the Pitt family about her ordeal. Unfortunately for Anne, she placed her trust in the wrong family member, because shortly after confessing what was troubling her, recounting her tale of little men dressed in green doing those things to her in a castle in the sky, this person reported her to the local authorities, and in short order, Anne was arrested and charged with witchcraft. She was even sent to jail for it. A piece of mail, written by the mayor of this small town where all this is said to have occurred, has been kept and preserved throughout history and can now be found in the Clarendon Manuscripts Archives. This document not only contains verification that Anne was held for quite some time in the jail, there's also a small portion that seems to back up her claim that the little men were in fact still coming to visit. It states how, despite being starved for several months, Anne never got sick and didn't ever seem to be starving or even hungry, as though someone were bringing her food regularly. Anne herself later confirmed this suspicion by telling Moses Pitt how the fairies did in fact feed her by bringing her unusual bread. However, the explanation as to what exactly she meant by unusual bread is either lost in time or never was. Obviously, this could have been very helpful to proving her innocence of not practicing witchcraft, especially back in the late 1600s. For whatever reason, Anne was eventually released from prison and the charges against her were dropped. She moved on with her life and eventually married a laborer named William Warren. She would later state, when pursuing a new career in nursing, that she wasn't sure how or why it had happened, why they had chosen her, but that the fairies had given her a wealth of knowledge in the medical and nursing fields, and she wanted desperately to use it to help others. And she eventually did become a nurse. In 1693, Moses Pitt, who had remained friends with Anne, though after she was accused in jail for witchcraft he did so in secret, decided to send a journalist friend of his named Humphrey Martin to interview Anne about all of her strange encounters and dealings with these little men dressed all in green. However, at that point, Anne didn't want to talk about it anymore for fear of what might happen to her if word got out again. She was quite comfortable and happy in her married life to William and her nursing career, and didn't care to revisit the alleged torment she went through, not only in jail, but in the Sky Castle. Humphrey Martin wrote to Moses Pitt in response saying, "As for Anne Jeffreys, I have been with her the greater part of one day, and did read to her all that you wrote to me, but she would not own anything of it. As concerning the fairies or any of the cures that she could perform, I asked her the reason why she would not do it. She replied that if she would discover it to you, that you would make books and ballads of it, and she said that she would not have her name spread about the country in books and ballads of such things." Now, at the time all this was happening with Anne, in the mid to late 17th century, the belief in fairies was very widespread and actually quite common, though almost always kept in secret for fear of being jailed and labeled a witch, like Anne. There were many reports of similar things happening to many different people all over the world. These castle in the sky encounters were the most common. While this is almost always related to a totally different type of abduction nowadays, it was always related to the FAE then. Continuing, I think it would be completely remiss of us to be speaking of the fairies and not mention the origin of fairy tales. Now, according to Wikipedia, the oral tradition of the fairy tale came along before the written page. Tales were told, retold, and enacted dramatically, whether about fairies or not. These tales were then told and passed down from generation to generation. Mystical and magical happenings and beings seem to be more a part of the fairy tale itself than actual fairies being included in such stories. The first written collections which attempted to preserve not only the theme and characters told in such tales were by the Brothers Grimm. While they had to later rewrite all the tales to make them more acceptable and also more profitable, due to the original content having mostly sexual overtones and not being child-friendly at all, any kind of talking animal, grotesque goblin, troll, beast, or monster can be considered a fairy tale. Also, tales of warning, meant to keep young children in line by telling of strange and horrible and unfortunate things that have allegedly happened to other children who, for instance, didn't eat their vegetables or clean their rooms. Those kids who didn't brush their teeth and told lies. There's always a lesson to be learned in these tales. Take them for what they're worth to you. While this is just the beginning of the vast information about a few different tales and legends of fairies, we've only begun to scratch the surface. Now, I'll leave you with some lesser-known information that may be helpful should you ever encounter one or maybe even a few of these little people. Know that, while the above stories seem to show a more benevolent side to these fairy legends, which in modern times have been Disneyfied, they are often known to be much more evil and complicated to pin down from one country to another in real life. However, most state that these creatures are master manipulators, and should you come across them, never, under any circumstances, enter into any kind of deal or arrangement with them. Again, they are considered to be master manipulators and also masters of language, and can find loopholes and use linguistic trickery to fool you into dealing with them for you to only too late realize you don't stand a chance at getting what you want or supposed to get, and yet the Fae get everything they are supposed to out of the deal. They will always benefit, mostly at the detriment of the other person. As they say in Vegas, the house always wins. Here are a few rules of engagement when it comes to these mystical beings. Never insult them and always be polite. Try your very best not to anger them, as this is how most people end up disappearing. If you ever get the feeling you're being watched by something invisible or get a sudden feeling you're not supposed to be where you are, turn around and leave immediately. Now, they do love presents and gifts. However, choose what you leave for them very carefully, as if whatever it is isn't sweet, your positive gesture can quickly turn into a negative experience. Think hard candy or other sugary sweets. Also, never use the words thank you or I'm sorry. For some reason, it is only acceptable to state pardon me and I appreciate that. The fairies have been known to sometimes speak in riddles, and there's almost always some kind of hidden meaning underneath what they're saying, so pay close attention and listen carefully. For instance, as one commenter on another video pointed out, I'm sorry admits fault, while pardon me simply asks for forgiveness. Also, thank you will put you in their debt, whereas I appreciate that simply expresses gratitude. Now, what do you think of all these encounters? Every culture since time immemorial has had these stories of the FAE or the fairy folk, including the Native Americans in Appalachia where I'm from. Do you believe these people exist? Do you believe that they are who caused people to disappear in the woods and forests and never to return? It seems lately that with all the craziness happening in the world, it's becoming easier and easier to forget about all the things that could be even worse going on in the world around us that we can't see. Seems like every time we turn on the television, there's just more and more destruction and chaos. And it gets me wondering, is this what they want? Is this all a very carefully carried out plan to take the focus away from the world of the unknown? To make sure we don't get too close to figuring out the truth about what really goes on behind the scenes? The things the powerful elite and possible government entities who we are indoctrinated to trust since the time we learned to talk don't want us to see? What is it they're trying to distract us from? Well, what we're going to focus on today is a continuation in the bizarre disappearances in the woods. After all, the families of the missing can never be distracted or distracted into forgetting that their loved one was here one minute and poof, gone the next. In researching the FAE and the connection with those who vanish, I have a feeling inside that I came so very close to touching on something. To lifting, or at least thinning out the veil that separates the actual truth from the reality we're taught to believe. After all, if you're subscribed to this channel and interested in this title, it stands to reason that you, too, are wondering what exactly is lurking in the woods. In the deep, dark parts of the world's forests and national parks, something is snatching and stalking helpless humans, seemingly right out of existence. Come and take another walk with me, folks, as I explore the deepest depths of not only the reality we see right in front of us, but perhaps the hidden worlds of the unknown, in the deepest, darkest depths of our very minds. But be careful. Don't be the first or last in line. Don't go near the boulder fields. Don't pick berries. Don't wear red. And don't insult that which you're unfamiliar with. And please, whatever you do, don't turn a corner and separate from the group. Here's part 2 of The Missing and the FAE. Before we begin, let's all try and get the images out of our head of the fairies, fae folk, that we were taught about as small children. The tiny, sparkly, and happy, always trying to help and devastatingly beautiful creatures who flutter around us wildly, sometimes sprinkling us with sparkly fairy dust to help us to sleep. Well, maybe something like that, as far as the fairy dust is concerned. But I'm convinced that there is something much more sinister afoot, that these very small, usually ornery and not so helpful beings use to confuse and put humans to sleep so they can steal them away, take them from the here that is known to there, which is unknown, or the other. If only it were simple and cutesy and fun as a little sprinkle of glittery dust and poof, all our troubles go away. In reality, however, it's more like sudden confusion which causes unrelenting panic as the hapless victims of these clever little tricksters, in the blink of an eye, find themselves completely lost, completely turned around, dazed and confused as to what just happened and where they are. Sometimes days are lost, sometimes more, and sometimes the victim is gone forever, lost to whatever game the fairies decided to make them a part of. Imagine, completely helpless, alone and afraid, screaming at the top of their lungs, only to find that they have no voice. Now, these little people are not always so little. While the majority of them are said to be under 4 feet tall, most even shorter, some have been said to be as tall as 7 feet. Just like humans, the way they look varies drastically from one to the other, with all having different facial features and personalities. Let's talk about some similarities between what's going on in the woods with all the clusters of missing people all over the world and what we know about the Fae. First off, boulder fields, and circles of stones in particular, should never be disturbed. This is where they live and play, and you do not want to disturb their home or resting place. They don't take kindly to anything they see disrespectful, and as seemingly very sensitive little creatures, that's most anything they don't give you permission to say or do. Do not even approach such places unless you're prepared for the fate that lay ahead of you, should you dare. After all, how could you be granted permission to do anything by entities in which you can't see with your human eyes unless they should choose to allow you to look upon them, which they most often do not give? If they ever should grant you this permission to gaze upon them, be wary, for they almost always have something up their sleeves. If you do not come prepared with gifts of sweets, alcohol, and or tobacco, do not expect a very generous welcome. In fact, if you do not bring such gifts, I suggest stay away altogether, as this will anger them, and they carry such great wrath for being so very tiny in size for the most part. There seems to also be an inordinate amount of people who go missing near berry bushes. You may be struck with an unexplained need to go and fill several baskets with juicy plump black or huckle or red or blueberries. There are too many kinds to name out there in the wild. We see all the time in movies about survival in the deep woods and forest that you should always beware of eating the berries to stay alive, for they might just be poisonous and, ironically, the very thing that kills you off. However, who do you think has poisoned the berries? Struck with a sudden and irresistible impulse to go and gather the fresh fruit, you're most likely lured by the Fae to your doom. They like to play, after all, and among the bushes and brambles of the berry patches is where they're known to do their dancing and mating. This is where they embrace the earth and sing with all their heart, sometimes fully visible, and most of the time at least audible to humans who are unfortunate enough to be in the general vicinity of them. If you should catch a glimpse of a dance or even a whisper of a tune, turn back, for they do not like to be disturbed. Again, they only like to be seen and heard if they choose it. If their choice should be taken away, then there will be consequences. Could this be the fate of so many who have disappeared among a berry patch in recent years? My advice? Go to your local grocer's produce section. They may not be as fresh picked, but hey, at least you won't be lost forever in the produce aisle. Fairies are known for more when it comes to disappearing things than taking humans and putting them somewhere else, either for a little while or for the rest of their days. If you aren't extremely careful in which paths you take and follow while out in the woods, you could just happen upon a fairy procession. They mostly take part in this activity by the light of the full moon, and should you stumble upon it, you just may be allowed to escape back to your home and your family and all that is loved by you, only to lose your mind within days, as the Fae have powerful magic. Just a look into their eyes, and your senses could be lost forever, with your physical body being wherever you are, while your mind is viewing their lives through their eyes, only you cannot decipher the difference. Should a fairy dressed in red approach and slap you about the body, surely you will die. Woe be unto anyone who tries to remove you from their grasp, even after death. Once a fairy claims you, you are rightfully theirs, at least as far as they're concerned. A person looking to investigate the effect the Fae have on or what part they play in the world of the missing has a lot to do with which cultures, legends, and lore you're looking into. In order to understand the way these little people work, you must know how things are done where they are from, and I don't just mean learning to avoid offending them or which treats to leave in case you should find yourself in their bad graces. Let's explore the world a little bit and see where these legends may have come from and what connection they could possibly have to all these cases of the missing popping up more and more frequently in today's news. In Ireland, there are many theories of origin for these devilish creatures. We spoke in part 1 about the belief that they are fallen angels or demons, or even the deceased that were unfortunately not good enough for heaven or bad enough for hell. There's another legend, however, one seemingly as old as time, which states that the Fae are certain children of Eve. According to this Celtic myth, when Eve was in the garden, after having tasted the forbidden fruit and learning she was naked, she hastily decided she must wash her children so they will be presentable in the sight of the Lord when he returned. Well, before she could wash them all, as there were many, she heard him fast approaching. She took all the children that were left that had not been bathed and hid them underground. Because she and Adam, and presumably in this tale all of their children as well, were then thrown out of and banned forever from the Garden of Eden because of the disobedience involving the fruit due to the trickery of the evil serpent, the unwashed children ended up being left behind, left underground to find and make their own way. Obviously, leaving children to live in their own underground world with no adult supervision ever could never lead to anything good, hence how the civilization was built. This fable differs a bit from time to time, with one of the ways it's told being God was simply angry in general for Eve not being able to keep all of her children constantly clean, and he took it as a sign of disrespect, as the children were constantly in his sight and presence very dirty. Therefore, during one of these times when he had come upon the children and most of them were unwashed, he was so angry that he took all who weren't clean and banished them to live underground, never being able to come up for 1,000 years. This punishment would ensure that Eve would never see them again and therefore be more diligent in making her children presentable in the sight of the Lord. Either way, it seems, the children were then left underground to their own devices and to fend for themselves, eventually cultivating and growing this community of little people who are seemingly childlike, but who keep ancient and dark magic within them. They hold the secrets to this magic very tightly and use it only when there's no other choice. Like, for example, if someone should disrespect them or their territory, as previously mentioned. Another theory of the Emerald Isle is that the Fae are an ancient race that preceded even the Celts in inhabiting the land we now know as Ireland, and England as well. The Celts then came in and drove the little creatures out of the land by destroying their civilizations and viciously slaughtering these little people, forcing those that survived to go underground and take part in a one-sided revenge war for the rest of time. This is why sometimes it's said that the Fae have a deep-rooted hatred for human beings, even though most modern-day legends and lore leave that part out, claiming simply that they are mischievous and mostly harmless. Either way, and no matter what you believe or which country's legends and lore you choose to set store by, they possess this ancient magic which no other human or creature possesses, and also which no one and nothing else can replicate. The last Irish legend we're going to discuss today is one that is most widely accepted as being the possible reason for the connection between the Fae and the missing 411 phenomenon, though we will only touch on the surface of it here. This legend says that the Fae are actually some form of interdimensional beings whose universe is somehow bumped up against or intertwined with ours. This makes sense for why sometimes we can see them and then in the blink of an eye they're gone. It could also explain why, once you've been selected and taken by them, you are never seen again. What is underground to us may be, for them, their very universe, their world. In fact, they may not even really be going underground at all, only seeming to, as this is the way they return to their own place in time. Modern-day scientists are constantly exploring theories as to whether or not these types of things, such as other dimensions and the ability to travel to and from them, are possible, and the general belief is vanished from our sight, from our plane of existence, and not necessarily that they've vanished forever without a trace anywhere. Now, let's get back to our world travels and see what some other countries have to say about where the Fae and the seemingly endless amounts of legends regarding them could have come from. In ancient times, it was well known that fairies actually cared more about humanity and what happened to human beings than most humans themselves did. This is especially true for human peasants. They are known throughout the world to have cultivated a wonderful relationship with the Fae and even worked to serve the Fairy Queen, as she and her minions cared more about and certainly helped them more than any nobility which was in power. In fact, fairies back in those days, before being driven underground, were just as likely to live in the house in the villages right along with the humans, sometimes without the humans' knowledge, but most times with not only their knowledge but also their blessing. They were known far and wide among the poorer classes and peasants as an ally, and as helpful little people who could use enchantment to keep certain towns, villages, or even individual houses where they were welcome and accepted, safe from the ravages of the many wars back then, and also from so many other deadly things someone from those times would have come across on a daily basis. The fairies helped make medicines with their magic to keep the villagers from becoming sick with one pandemic or another, and sometimes they would even return a child from death, if, of course, the price was right. Although there was always too large a consequence for both the humans and the fairies involved, so this was not often done. They were even known to make entire villages invisible to keep them safe from an approaching torch mob or an angry army. Remember how long ago this all was, though, and please don't give it much thought should you ever encounter a fairy or one of their many dwelling places. Though we are not entirely sure why this relationship has changed so drastically throughout the ages, we can be quite sure that it has, and that's really all we need to know. It's said that humans have simply moved on and forgot how we were helped by the Fae, forgot how essential they once were to the survival of our very species, and because of this, some of the Fae now seek revenge. Unwilling to be used and then tossed aside when no longer needed like some kind of old rag, the disrespect they feel for and the disdain they have towards the human race, at least in some fairy cultures, and yes, they have different cultures which hold different beliefs and act in different ways as well. Some choose to exist on the edges of our vision, wanting nothing but peace and to just keep out of the way of humans altogether. Then there are the other kinds, the kind which we will discuss right now. Keep in mind always that regardless of how their feelings toward humanity have either evolved or devolved throughout the centuries, all the Fae folk are known to be either a bit or almost completely devilish in nature. It's something they can't help, even if they should want to. They can be extremely benign or extremely dangerous, with the latter being akin to vampires, literally sucking the life force out of any human it should encounter and using the ancient magic in its being to disappear any of the evidence, perhaps back to its own dimension. Let's move on to discussing the many different types of encounters one could possibly have with the Fae. The first type would be the testing of morality encounters. If there's one thing almost all the legends about them have in common, is that they are enforcers of morality, which is why they live so much by the code of mutual respect. They will often appear to test a person's generosity and kindness. And when I think about missing 411, I think of the young children who go missing without a trace and wonder, after exploring this type of encounter deeper, if the Fae know the difference between the mind of an adult and the mind of a human child. Keep this question in mind as we move forward. Keep the encounters that are known to be had and the types of people who go missing in mind, and see if you can't figure out, possibly, which encounter each group of missing may have had to experience in order to fail the test and end up missing in this world, or this plane of existence, forever. If we assume the missing haven't come across the type of enchanting fairy who will use their powers and magic of enchantment to seduce you simply to drain your life force, your blood, to gain their strength, you may encounter the type mentioned above. During such encounters, the fairy will often disguise itself as a beggar or some other person who is in desperate need of something you possess. Those who help out and are kind and generous will receive blessings, for example, being led out of the woods if one should be lost. But if you are unkind and not helpful at all, and perhaps even show some disdain toward the pathetic fellow whose form it has chosen, then woe be unto you. You will face dire consequences, sometimes even the loss of your very life. Perhaps even worse, you might be led to be invisible to the human eye and left to wander about circling the same part of the forest again and again in some kind of enchantment where there is never a way out. Perhaps there you'll be for all eternity, with your loved ones or even the authorities right within your reach, only you will forever be unable to grasp them. The Fae were known to bury entire villages in avalanches or drown them in floods because of just one bad encounter with just one unsympathetic human who very well could have just been having a bad day. The second type of encounter one might have is when a fairy chooses you to help them carry out some kind of work they need to do. Should you accept and help the Fae again, you will receive some form of blessing, although you quite possibly won't have any memory of the encounter or the work in which you helped them carry out. However, if you should refuse, you could very well be driven into madness. A madness so deep you will never come out of it. A madness that some might say is worse than even death itself. Keep in mind always, despite the intention of the little person you encounter, they have a spitefulness and mean streak deeply ingrained into them, especially when it comes to the human race, who so callously abandoned them once they were released from the throes of poverty and destitution of ancient times. In this modern world, to most, they are nothing more than fairy tale creatures, and obviously this offends them greatly. Some cultures, even to this day, believe that this is where mental illness comes in. Remember how we established the Fae used to live side by side in the same home as humans, and some of them still choose to visit a home from time to time? In fact, some hauntings can even be possibly attributed simply to an offended little person. The Fae will sit invisible on the shoulder of the person deemed mad and torment them day and night without rest or sleep, essentially driving them to their early graves. Always make sure to return a favor given to you by a fairy. They will sometimes show up to offer help when it's most needed at some point in a human's life, perhaps while grieving the loss of a loved one or while in some kind of health crisis. The little person will use the ancient magic in them to heal the person or provide a deep sense of peace and comfort. They do these things, for the most part, without asking for permission, so technically you accept without knowing it. Then you are forever indebted to the Fae, and all the bad luck and misfortune will find you should you not repay these favors immediately when called upon to do so. As we already discussed, there are many different types of Fae folk, just as human beings. Some are inherently helpful and kind, while some are infinitely evil and downright deadly. The latter type are known to target specific humans, usually for the smell of their blood is appealing to the devilish fiend, or for some other type of reason we have neither way of knowing nor controlling. This type will seek a person out simply to drink its blood, torment it, or, and here's where the mind might wander to the missing, take the human as an eternal slave. After all, just because they are much more diminutive in size than us humans, remember how strong their magic is. We as a species seem to have lost most, if not all, of our ancient magic, and therefore the Fae are much more powerful in every single conceivable way than we are. They may not be able to overtake us with strength alone, but make no mistake, they are much stronger mentally and magically, and are a most formidable opponent. My mind can't help here but to wonder to all of the intellectuals who are known to go missing on a random hunting or hiking trip. Could it be these Fae creatures have happened upon randomly or specifically hunted down these extremely intelligent beings, or they have grown bored of playing with intellectually inferior humans they normally encounter? Perhaps they enjoy the mental sparring so much, they choose to keep this human with them forever, using it as some sort of sick plaything to see how long it takes to mentally break down such a smart person to their most basic form of caveman mentality, thus draining the human slave/toy of all its intelligence right down to its most basic human knowledge of the world and itself over a period of possibly centuries, all the while keeping it hidden from other humans and feeding off its life force. Until, inevitably, the human dies and the fairy must then move on to what it sees as a bigger and better challenge in the form of another human, who may be even smarter and more intellectually advanced than its last pet. Keeping in mind all the time while exploring this theory that time passes differently for the Fae, with what seems centuries to us as mere minutes or even seconds to them. My advice? Keep some kind of iron on you at all times, and make sure it's clearly visible when traveling about, especially in the deep woods. This is one of the only things known throughout all cultures to even be remotely successful at keeping the fairies at bay. One of the many deeply ingrained powers of humanity is our ability to use symbols and objects to break other species, beings, and magical powers, especially when those powers are dark and turned toward us. Perhaps it's magic, or maybe it's just an uncanny knack for getting rid of curses and hexes. The same is true when it comes to warding off the Fae. Despite the many missing, who most are sure fell victim to a rambling and dangerous Fae, we, as a species, have been most successful. Let's talk now about symbols and objects known to break magical power, including the magic of the Fae. Historically, these include but aren't limited to rabbit's feet, inside-out clothing, crosses, and believe it or not, even pictures of a Japanese emperor have all been known to successfully prevent further or initial attacks on humans. Some of you may be familiar with these things, and some may not. Either way, it's definitely something we should all know, especially those of us who spend any time at all in the woods or forests. Okay, let's be honest, even if we spend time in our own backyard. First, those of us who know how to use the evil eye are in luck, as this is said to be the most effective way to injure a fairy and defend ourselves during an attack, either on the mind or body. The evil eye is second in winning its victory in this way, only to non-galvanized iron. It is said that some races can't even be looked upon by humans without being injured. Others can't use their magic against us when presented with the evil eye. So, if you aren't aware of what this is or how to effectively use it, maybe you should learn. Unless a fairy has attached itself to you as a familiar, and trust me, you will know if this has happened, never accept its hospitality. It's completely impossible to tell the difference between a well-meaning and helpful fae who cares deeply about humanity and an evil one who is pretending so it can lure you into its web for either the reason of making you a slave or a snack. Trust me when I say you won't know until it's far too late. You don't have to verbally accept anything or even acknowledge these small, seemingly benign and insignificant gestures of so-called hospitality either. All you have to do is anything other than clearly stating no. Remember, though, not to be offensive or insulting in any way unless you're prepared to fight. Once you've danced with, accepted food from, or even allowed a fairy to brush your hair, you're in their complete and total debt. So be sure and keep your wits about you, and don't be fooled. The nice and friendly kind are far harder to come by, as humanity and its wars and destruction of the very forest they make their homes in is definitely on almost all species of fairies' naughty list. And many are just aching for revenge. Keep in mind here too, even if the fairy wishes no ill intent towards you and has no plans to kill or enslave you for accepting these gestures of goodwill from them, even if the gestures are genuine, once you accept, you're automatically in the fairy realm and no longer in our world. In that case, even if the fairy you're canoodling with means you no harm, once in their realm, it will be all the more harder for you to protect yourself against any attacks from the more vengeful and bloodthirsty type among them. See, unless the fairy is a familiar of yours, and this doesn't simply mean you know it well or its friend, I'm talking more like a witch's familiar, like they have sometimes in black cats or other animals. It will be unable and more than likely unwilling to protect you while in the realm of the other fae. They will face dire consequences and repercussions simply for befriending a human and offering this hospitality to you, and can face certain death from fairies higher up in the realm than they are, and will never be willing to risk or sacrifice themselves to protect you. They could even be compelled to join in your torture. Make no mistake that they will, too, if it means saving themselves. It's basically impossible to return to our own world or realm once we have entered that of the fae. We will be forever lost, possibly a story in someone's missing person in the woods video here on YouTube. There's always the chance you'll just waste away, whether or not you could get back had you eaten or danced with these little beings. Many a human has been known to wander between realms, never again experiencing happiness or pleasure, not even on the smallest scale, after having dined, danced, or spent time with the fae. Many who are of the opinion fairies are directly responsible for many, if not most, of the missing 411 in the woods and forest encounters will tell you that sometimes it's just a twist of fate or bad luck to have stumbled upon a fairy or its colony. It can happen, and more often than not does, that without the human or the fairy planning it at all, the human will stumble upon it or their paths will somehow cross. In this case, it's best not to try and reason with them or explain yourself, as this is when, throughout history, humans have been most well known to try and steal their treasures. Best to just apologize and move along as quickly as possible, provided that is that they allow you to. Perhaps when in the forest, keep a bit of alcohol, tobacco, or sweets with you in case something like this should happen. You're more likely to be allowed to leave in one piece if you can give them a gift, a peace offering, if you will. There are certain times, though, very, very limited in nature, that a fae folk may truly be in need of human assistance and will therefore honestly try and hire you to do some work for them. Examples may include when their colony comes under attack, say by a deity or a ghost or spirit who wishes to overtake their colony, cause general mischief, or even kill and overthrow the fairy queen. The fairies will then seek to employ a human being to draw a cross on the trees where they've made their home. This somehow allows the fae to hide safely within the tree without being seen by the evil entities. Keep in mind that this can be a very dangerous job for the human, as these beings can also, as most of us know, either possess, cause harm to, stalk, or even kill us or our loved ones. The fae are all but defenseless against them, which is why they need us in the first place. However, if you should succeed in helping the fairies to hide from these mortal enemies and help to save and preserve their colony and queen, you will be rewarded just as you would be by a Germanic woodwife, which is with a full bag of lovely scented wood chips. Be sure to thank and graciously accept this payment, as it's said that as soon as you leave the forest with this treasure, that is indeed what it becomes as the chips turn to pure gold. There are stories of mean-spirited and ungrateful humans who have gone out of their way to do this work for the Fae people and refused to accept their most fantastic gift, feeling as though the saving of their kind should have earned more than a mere bag of wood chips. This did not work out well for that person, as they are said to now roam the forest where they committed this slight against the Fae, and they're left as mere phantoms, knowing not whether they're coming or going, never knowing themselves or anything out of space and time again. A perpetual circle in the forest, left like prey to any and all other creatures and entities that roam those same forests, a sheep perpetually being led to some horrible fate and definite slaughter. Oh, and if you should be so unlucky as to stumble across a fairy child, just do your best to help it find its way, regardless of how mischievous and ungrateful it may be towards you. For these small beings are taught that humans are basically the boogeyman. You may or may not get anything for your trouble, though. It depends on the relationship its parents have with the human race, whatever their experiences may have been, good or bad. However, if you refuse to help or insult the child in some way, woe be unto you, as you'll end up in the aforementioned perpetual phantom state. Finally, the Fae folk most often will seek the help of certain humans, depending on your aura field, which they can very easily read, to clean their fields, birth their children, guard their queen, and watch their cattle. Should you do a good job, you will earn the wage of gold or the relief from something that is ailing you. The fairies are known to not only be able to cause, but to cure most human aches and pains, but also some diseases as well. Regardless of what the payment is, you are encouraged to just accept the task asked of you by the Fae. Do not try and find out what the pay or reward will be in advance, as this is considered to be very rude. As a rule, fairies themselves are generally hardworking and consider it abhorrent behavior for anyone to refuse a hard day's work, regardless of what the pay might be. Remembering we are also speaking of the mysterious missing here, I'd be remiss not to remind you that if you do not know by sight or sound which Fae you are dealing with, it's best to be extremely careful not to stumble upon them in general. There are some races of the Fae, the Baba Yaga for one, who will hire a human with promise of great reward, only to give them impossible tasks to complete, so the end of the day sees much punishment, possibly enslavement, going missing in the human realm, for as long as the Fae see fit. Is this what has happened to the very few who have gone missing in the forest for long stretches of time, only to return, either not remembering or refusing to speak of where they had been the whole time? Perhaps we'll never know. After all, the Fae are known to be quite tight-lipped, and regardless of how friendly one species may be toward the humans, as we say, blood is thicker than water, and at the end of the day, most of the Fae will stick with their own kind. I want to reiterate some of what we should have taken from this story today, as my concern for the missing is ever growing the more I myself learn about these little creatures of lore known as the Fae. Keep in mind that generally they are not the wish-granting, super cute and sparkly little lovers portrayed in fairy tales and children's bedtime stories. They are nasty and ill-tempered with a great love of abducting people, humans to be exact. It's one of their favorite pastimes actually, and the stalking of the prey is what they enjoy most, almost more than the actual abduction and enslavement itself. Pointing back to the missing 411 phenomena and all the unfortunate disappearances there, let's take a look now at some of the correlation between the parameters that are set up and how almost all of them can somehow be traced back to the Fae and their fiendish pastimes. Storms and weather events. Fairies are nature spirits and can control the elements, mainly water and storms. In the case of the missing, search and rescue are often stopped and put on indefinite hold because of some inclement weather event that seems to come up out of nowhere. If you were a fairy and had abducted some poor unsuspecting human, would you not use all of your power over the elements to stop the human from being found? Keeping in line with the elemental facts of possible fairy involvement in these missing cases, I point you now towards the boulder fields and bodies of water found in the area where a lot of these people went missing from. In folklore, bodies of water, particularly streams and brooks found in most forests and national parks, are known to belong to elemental beings, which the Fae definitely are, and the element they manipulate the most is thought by some to be water. Boulder fields, on the other hand, are known all over the world as the domains of the Fae. You'd be hard-pressed to find a fairy legend where they did not have dominion over all the boulder fields and small bodies of water in the forest. Not only in the missing 411 phenomena cases, but also in UFO, Sasquatch, and cryptid literature, you will find a general refusal from most animals, search dogs in particular, refusing to venture into woods that once they would have explored without hesitation. These dogs are usually trained to search and rescue and hunt. However, in so many cases of the missing, we find that the canines just absolutely refuse to do the job they were born and trained to do. A job which any other time they love to do. The dogs are scared. Plain and simple, and looking into much of fairy folklore, you will see precisely why this happens. This behavior is not only rife in fairy lore, but also becoming more and more common in each missing person case we've come across where a search and rescue canine was employed. They simply refuse to pick up the scent. The same is true for the missing's pets, who unfortunately accompanied them out into the wilderness and most likely witnessed the fairy abduction. The dogs are afraid of the fray, as I reiterate. They are nasty and mean little creatures and sometimes put a hex of confusion on the poor mutts, making it chase and bite its own tail, sometimes going so far as to invisibly injure the animal. That's right, they use fairy magic and play a game with their children, sort of like the human version of piñata, only with magical needles that make the animal bleed but leave no mark. I won't explain further, just use your imagination. The next connection I want to help you understand is one many find the most creepy of all: the disembodied sounds heard by search and rescue people and volunteers. They will hear disembodied screams for help or moaning sounds of pain coming from somewhere deep in the wilderness, yet nowhere. The issue? The sounds are the voices of the missing individual they are currently out searching for. The person is already enslaved by the time the searchers come to the rescue, remembering the inclement weather and refusal of animals to hunt, which buys the fairy more time to capture its victim, and perhaps to hunt them and have their fun for a little while longer. By the time the Fae lifts all these magic, it's too late. Though the victim hasn't figured that out yet and still clings to the hope he or she will be heard, not knowing they are already lost, forever. Doomed to a life of slavery worse than anything imaginable, worse even than death. Ever wonder why some people turn up dead and some are just lost forever, never to be found, not hide nor hair of them? Well, the explanation for this is actually quite simple for anyone familiar with the Fae and their ways. You see, it's all about usefulness. Who of the humans will pose the biggest challenge to them? They don't, for example, want to hunt someone who isn't going to give them a run for their money. This is also why people who are extremely smart and very athletic, even avid hunters, are never found and seemingly lost in the very blink of an eye. The Fae want a challenge. After they've played enough, it's time to test the human's intellectual strength and or physical prowess, depending upon their particular need for that particular slave for that day. If the person proves to be useful, either physically, intellectually, or both, the Fae will keep them. If not, they will be killed and returned to our dimension, our realm, if you will. The reason places are searched dozens of times just for the person to turn up days later in the exact same spot is because the Fae was kind of interviewing them, if you will, only not for a job. Oh no, they were being interviewed for what kind of slave they'd make best. After it's decided that they are indeed useful, they will be magically transported into the Fae realm, never to be seen or heard from again, leaving absolutely no trace. How familiar does this sound to some missing person cases? Every once in a while, a mischievous and especially cruel Fae, usually a child or young adult, will place articles of clothing here or there simply to watch the searchers find it and get a renewed sense of hope. Then they stand by for days, watching and waiting until they see the hopes suddenly dashed upon the realization that they would find nothing more. In the case of the shoes, it's simple. The Fae are extremely clean folk, and shoes are very, very dirty, especially after someone has been chased through the forest, which is why the shoes are left behind. The final focus point in some of these missing persons cases I want to discuss is the berry picking. This is the simplest of all explanations, which is why I chose to do it last. Berries that grow in the forest are considered by the Fae to be their own food. They love the delicious and plump seasonal fare that grows all over some bushes near water. After all, they collect and store them, in case of a shortage of maybe human blood that year, and therefore to simply pick a single berry, let alone dare to taste or eat a bunch of them, is considered thievery to the Fae and will be punishable by eternal enslavement and possibly death. In closing, is there really any truth to these legends and lore? If not, then why do they exist, and why were they told in the first place? Is there some nugget of truth in these? While it's easy to connect the dots in reverse, are we really just embracing some of these old stories to put our minds at ease because there is no real scientific or rational explanation for these cases where people have gone missing without leaving a single trace of anything behind? As Charles Fort once wrote, one measures a circle beginning anywhere. If nothing else, these stories and legends of the Fae give our minds something to focus on besides the truly unthinkable, that people can and do disappear, and we have no idea why or where they have gone. Hello, friends. Welcome to The Missing and the Fae, Part 3. Now, before we begin, I must once again remind everyone that fairies are not what we grew up and knew them to be as children. They are not the cherub-faced, impeccably gorgeous, teeny-tiny little things who land on your right shoulder, perhaps, and sprinkle pixie dust on you to help you fly away to a magical land. Now, as we discussed in Part 2, maybe something like that with the pixie dust, but today we're going much deeper, possibly darker, into the scary world of the missing and the Fae. After all, let's also not forget that the Fae are supernatural, and they precede humanity. So much about them is still unknown to us. From what we do know, fairies are actually some of the most frightening and dreadful creatures a human could ever encounter, especially in the deep, dark depths of forests and woodlands, and national parks. Fairies are magic, and magic in the wrong hands can be deadly. Let's go and explore again, folks. Let's learn about just a few of the many different types of Fae folk one might encounter when out on a hike or just exploring the woods behind your house. Now, could these Fae folk be at least a part of the reason why people all over the world are going missing in the blink of an eye and vanishing without a trace? Fairies are reportedly seen everywhere and anywhere. Wherever there are boulder fields and berry patches, streams of water, circles of stone, their places of dwelling, if listed, could go on and on. Don't let their mostly small stature fool you. Fairies themselves are magic, and they know how to use it, for better or for worse, for good or for bad, for life or death. This fact alone makes them so much more formidable than we recognize because of how tiny they usually are. So here we go again, into the world of the Fae. Be careful. Make sure you have your gifts of tobacco, candy sweets, and liquor. Take off your red clothing, and make sure you're in the middle of the line. And whatever you do, don't leave the group, and don't pick those berries. Also, don't set out and seek something which you cannot possibly understand. If you're unfortunate enough to ever happen upon a fairy, remember to never give them your name, for this gives them power and possibly even complete control over you. Perhaps give them a fake name or even a nickname. And remember, if you know their name and say it aloud so they can hear it, they must leave you alone. Who knows why? It's simply a law of fairy nature, as far as the Fae are concerned. When trees die, sometimes springs of wild mushrooms sprout up in its place. Many believe this is where the portals to the fairy realms lie. Inside these mushroom rings, these fairy rings, never even stand inside of one, let alone fall asleep. Upon first hearing this, I couldn't help but wonder if maybe this is one of the reasons people are going missing. Being lost in the woods for days and sometimes even weeks, a human being is going to get hungry. Someone dehydrated, confused, and most likely delirious and possibly even hypothermic isn't going to be thinking straight and may see these mushrooms as food. Is this another lure? Are the Fae themselves what are making these people suddenly sick and needing to separate from the group, only to find themselves confused and lost and not knowing even sometimes who or where they are? Maybe they suddenly come upon these mushrooms and in their discombobulated state decide to eat them. Who knows, maybe the fairies even put it in their minds to do so. Then they enter the fairy realm, and who knows what is done with them. Most likely their loved ones will never see them again. Mushroom rings equals fairy trap. Lesson number 1. Now, there are many types of phenomena that come along with a fairy encounter. Sometimes a person will experience just one of these things, and other times they'll experience 2 or more, sometimes all. One thing we've been hearing about more and more recently in the stories are what I like to call the almost missing. This is a profound silence, suddenly coming upon nature right before the encounter. I've experienced this myself. A kind of static electricity, energy type feeling will enter the air as well, leaving all the hairs on your bodies to stand completely on end. One of those electric charges like right before a loud and particularly violent thunderstorm. There will be a sense of losing time somehow. Of course, with no way of knowing why or how the time was lost, and sometimes even where it went to. Many people report, while experiencing a Fae encounter, one they thought they had just happened to come across randomly, whether to their great or terrible luck, there's a sense in the back of the mind somehow, perhaps even in their subconscious, that whatever display they're witnessing is being put on just for them, as though it wasn't such a random or chance encounter at all. There's always either an unusually clouded or unusually vivid memory of the experience, and you could also start to feel as though this particular sighting or event happened at a very specific time in your life, as if it were fate, somehow with the Fae encounter, somehow marking a turning point in your life, a crossroads, a new beginning. Perhaps these stories were made up by the Fae themselves in order to cause those who hunt them to think them more harmless and unassuming. This reconciliation being that we do not have to toss these old legends aside completely and come to know the Fae in a different light. Perhaps they'll become even more enchanting to us, even as we become more aware of the danger associated with and all around them. Now let's talk about the missing and the Fae folk. We've talked before about many of the parameters used when deciding which cases of missing people fit into the completely baffling, those which have no other explanation at all than something we humans may consider otherworldly. We know the Fae are much more commonly reported as being seen than angels or even demons. However, we still know much less about them. We know they're misunderstood for sure, keeping in mind again what we've always been told about them and what's actually the truth. When a person goes missing, all we really have to go on is either the scant evidence left behind, if there even is any, or the testimony of the people who, for whatever reason, were allowed to come back. Yes, I use the word allowed here because there's no way of escaping the fairy realm without permission. Once you've entered a portal, even by complete misstep or accident, you will be trapped there forever unless you're granted permission to leave. And speaking of all the many types of different fairies some of the missing may have encountered right before they vanished, the mind may begin to wander to all of the causes of death, all of the ways we try to be reasonable and rationalize the way in which some of the people were said to have met their end while in the woods. We've talked much about the hideous and unimaginable creatures some of the Fae folk actually are, but there are also some species who are inherently beautiful and charming, much like the fairy stories we've heard of old. I wonder if it's even more likely that it was some of these types who have led many of the missing to their own demise. Sort of beautiful ones going out as bait for the more terrifying ones. Now, when exploring how many people are said to be hypothermic, I can't help but be reminded of the Asarai fairy. Similar to, but not the same as a mermaid, the Azrai are incredibly beautiful, but quite shy. Most nomadic creatures who aren't all inherently evil tend to be sometimes. The touch of the Azrai's hand, however, will cause the human skin to become so very cold it can never feel warm again, thus possibly inducing the hypothermic condition that is said to be responsible for many of the missing who are later found deceased under strange circumstances. Although said to only surface once a century, it's not certain for how long this once-a-century visit is for from these Fae folk. Who knows how many victims it has time to take from this earth in that time. As mentioned earlier, we sometimes receive stories from those who were missing for periods of time, and sometimes those stories tell of being misled while trying to find their way in the woods. We know already fairies are made of magic and can use it and bend humans at their whim. When I think of the delightfully mischievous pixie, I can't help but wonder as well if this isn't the fairy the lost traveler comes upon. These little troublemakers mislead traveling humans about where they should go next, about which path to take to find their way to where they're meaning to end up. This is like a sport for them. Most of the time it's done telepathically or through suggestion, but every once in a while you will hear the stories of the Disneyfied pixies whispering in a lost traveler's ear. Be very wary of their charm, for nothing they utter ever seems to be the truth. It's simply how they're made. Are they working in tandem with other magic or unseen forces or beings in the woods and forests, helping these others to lure a hapless and unwitting human into their trap? That's something else to add to the long list of things we may never know. Well, some of us may find out, but it's doubtful if we do, we'll ever be able to speak of it again. Remember, pixies are said to be changelings. Instead of working with another being or creature, could they be the very thing? Do they play a sick form of manhunt or tag with each other using the humans? Some wonder if the infamous flannel man is in fact just a shape-shifting pixie. Throughout the past two videos, we've learned so much about the Fae, and yet we still haven't even scratched the surface. We often wonder why the fairies would ever need a mere human for anything so serious to keep them longer than the time it takes to get some quick chores done. A very simple interaction. What is the attraction? Well, there's a type of fairy that desperately needs humans in order to continue breeding, to save their own race. This would be the classic elves. Now, not Santa's elves. These elves are said to be half human, after all, and they can only go so many generations without a human being donating some DNA to their bloodlines before they become extinct. These little beings are endowed with a sense of excellent hearing and sight, and they're also quite graceful and charming. But don't be fooled with the knowledge of how these little ones possess a natural defense against any and all dark arts and black magic. Simply because they possess it, that doesn't mean necessarily that they never use it. Though I'm sure, just like humans, all form of Fae folk, all species, have their good and bad attitudes. Another species of Fae who are said to have superior physical beauty are the mer people. This, of course, is depending on who you ask, as in recent years humans believe that they have come to know that these species of half human and half fish would have fangs like a piranha and no need for hair, even the females. However, let's suppose, just for a minute, that what most of the research said about these mer people is in fact accurate. Let's imagine for a moment that they are aesthetically pleasing and almost too beautiful to look at directly. They're quite known to be the ones who lure sailors and seamen to their deaths. The female's enchanting beauty is absolutely irresistible to the human man. These half-fish, half-human bombshells must do this sometimes to save their own species as well. While we are simply speaking of the missing in the woods, I'll move on. But make no mistake that those sirens are just waiting for some poor fisherman to cross their path. Think of all the missing who have ended up in the water and were never captured on any cameras going in, and with no eyewitnesses either. Could it be a form of mer-person that's involved with these abductions? Of course, it's not the seawater dwelling type, but who knows, perhaps there are freshwater versions too. Who could ever really know all the possible types and species of any creature? It's been said that every year in the Amazon, tens of thousands of new species of creatures that we do know of are found. What about the species that we don't have any knowledge of? How many of those are out there? Even if we can't prove the fabled ones exist, that doesn't mean that they don't. After all, mer people are said to be able to manipulate the sea. Who's to say there isn't a type which dwells in lakes and regular unsalted bodies of water and does just this to their unsuspecting victims, taking them as slaves? We can't say, and we may never be able to either. Although, if you look back at some of your Native American legends, particularly those of the Cherokee, they warn about creatures in lakes that lure people in to take them. This next entry may surprise some of you, depending on which of the many legends you've heard of the Banshee. The Irish legend of the Wailing Woman, whose vocal trillings warn of someone about to meet their demise. Depending on which tale you're familiar with, the Banshee is either a beautiful enchantress or a raggedy old hag. Regardless of what she looks like, no household or member of it can escape her torturous wailing. When the Banshee comes a-calling, her looks aren't going to matter to you. Not every single species of fairy is inherently mischievous, malevolent, or evil. There are very few exceptions, sure, but exceptions there are. Take the brownie, for example. Have you ever wondered about all the people that have survived such rough and exhausting weeks and months in the deepest, darkest parts of the woods and forests, only to have some strange story of miraculous survival? Well, could it be the brownies? Brownies get their name from their brown skin and hair. While not visible to ordinary people, only those with the second sight are said to be able to see these little ones. They are able to shapeshift into anything they like. They are another breed of changeling, and although they usually take the image of farm or domestic animals when doing so, they sometimes take on the form of what or whoever the person lost and ill would be most comfortable with. Even staging the meeting sometimes as an hallucination, putting the human in kind of a dream state, so as to blur the lines of memory lest they never discover it was in fact a brownie who had healed them and nursed them back to health before sending them on their way to safety. Perhaps even protecting them from the other, more mischievous and dangerous type of fey creatures. Remember that the legends of the Fae come from every culture all around the world. Is this just a coincidence? That every culture, dating almost to the beginning of time, has had some sort of legend regarding some sort of fairy type? Probably not. It's probably because they actually do exist, just the sightings of them are becoming less reported. In general, the Fae folk and their rules are very different from ours, and we will most likely never be able to know about or even understand all of their little synchronicities. Even if the more benevolent, even if a little bit mischievous types can cause so much damage as mentioned above, how about the other more dark and sinister types? What role could they possibly play in these missing and vanishing events happening all over the globe these days? In the wilderness, most times, all of the elements of the earth seem to come together, yet remain separate. The streams and the ponds which feed the soil, which grow the plant life, which gives life to the air and to humans, and sometimes even the inclement weather or some other force causes there to be fire. Almost all fairies tie themselves to one element in particular, and usually do not travel outside the bounds of that element. If they are the type to typically travel in groups, they will do so with members of their same element. Let's explore some of the more hurtful and perhaps vengeful types of Fae species, and look at their possible roles and what's going on with these disappearances. Now, there's much talk about alternate dimensions and portals, and perhaps the missing crossing accidentally into one from another while lost and trying to find their way back. Sometimes even being led or completely compelled to do so by an outside force, fairy or otherwise. It's true, fairies usually live close to humans. However, their dwelling places are always distinctly separate, and most of the time they're on a plane or in a dimension even, right above or below our human one. The real changelings, as in fairy children which have been swapped for a human child, are one of the most terrifying types of malevolent fae. While technology has made it almost impossible for fairies to go around swapping their babies with humans, it does happen every now and again. The child, as it grows, will always have trouble fitting in. Not only will they always be more beautiful than the rest of the children their age, but they will also have trouble relating. This leads to a life of constant isolation, which can make some of them snap. Now, this could explain a whole other type of human problem in society for the past few decades or so. The child murderer, the child who kills. That's not what we're here to discuss today, but maybe another time. Another time indeed. Divas, or devas, are tiny fairies which resemble fireflies. In fact, if you live or are in, for whatever reason, a wooded area, you're almost certainly going to come across a deva. Known to hang around well-cared-for plants and to flutter far away from decaying or dying flora in the wilderness, is this what entices the flower pickers who go missing from time to time? Could be. Are these the creatures who either intentionally or otherwise lure the little children into the woods never to be seen or heard from again? Now just picture that. A small child chases fireflies to collect in a jar and keep its light for a few minutes, and as the diva or the firefly flies away, 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 so the child roams and follows and follows and follows till they're inexplicably lost, maybe never to be seen again. Maybe, perhaps, to be kept in a fairy child's jar, where its cries can be kept quiet for a while, till the fairy child loses interest, just the same as the human child does after a while of the firefly's beautiful glow. The last topic it would do us well to spend just a little more time on in this episode are the missing children. Not the ones who return to tell the tales of their grandmother being a robot and taking them underground, or that a bear kept them warm and fed them berries. No, I'm talking about the ones who never return, who left no trace, like little Dennis Martin, who disappeared seemingly into thin air, right off the face of the earth, out of existence, or so it seems. It would be reasonable to assume that the fairies work under a concept known as Bindith Imama. This translates to mother's blessing. Could it be possible that the Fae see themselves this way? These lesser-known fairies who indulge in the nefarious act of actual kidnapping? At least that's what we as humans call it. These are the Fae who are usually responsible for the aforementioned changelings. They have a nasty little habit of taking healthy human babies and leaving their own not-so-healthy little crimbles, as they're called, in the human child's place. This is what they call it, the Fae. Crimbles meaning the replacements. Parents of the pilfered children have to consult a witch in order to get their offspring back. Sometimes, though, as strange as it may sound, the Fae folk actually return the child on their own, but only after it's been instilled in the child a great love and appreciation for music. Think about that. Well, that wraps it up for this episode. What do you think about these alternate theories for the missing? Could it be the work of the Fae or some other elemental creatures that we know very little about and believe only exist in storybooks? Hello, friends. As we've learned from previous videos on this subject, fairies have been around since the beginning of recorded time, perhaps even earlier. They play an important role in many cultures' folklore all around the world. Some believe they are benevolent and still think of the Disney-fied Tinkerbell versions of pixies and sprites as how all fairies are in nature and how they communicate with us humans. Others, however, know better and know the truth, just as we in this community are starting to learn through this series. Fairies, or the Fae, are portrayed as demons, fallen angels, elementals, nature spirits. The list goes on and on for each culture's explanation of the Fae. They are known to have all kinds of supernatural powers and accused of being responsible for all types of magical and even paranormal activities. We've gone through some of the types of the Fae and what we believe their purpose is here in our realm. We've talked about how some species enslave humans and to what end they do so. Today, we're going to walk through the account of fairy sightings and interactions. Is there a specific type of person more likely to see them? Are they more inspired to kidnap and take back to their realm one type of human over another? What type of mischief do they cause? Let's take a look at some Fae encounters through the ages and see if we can make some connections. Welcome to The Missing and the Fae, Part 4. Believe it or not, there is one place in the United States that has had so many Fae encounters that to those of us who are interested in and researching these topics could possibly give this place the name the fairy capital of the United States. What mysterious and unknown woodland or forest am I speaking of here? Well, neither. Would you believe Detroit, Michigan? Now, this is not just a couple of sightings by New Age intellectuals trying to push the fairies are real and can live in urban areas too agenda. For centuries, there have been reports of gnomes and other species of little people in the Detroit area. Some of them date back even before the Europeans settled here. So basically, before it was even named Detroit, possibly before the state of Michigan even existed. Is it something about the land there? Did the settlers intrude on some magical place where the veil between our world and theirs is so much more thin? Let's look at some of these Fae encounters and see if we can figure it out. The origins of our first story lie within the Ottawa tribe. These are the natives who were living on the land before the English and French settlers came in and took it over. This particular encounter tells of the red dwarf, as the natives called them. These little people are just as mischievous as their brother and sister species and can be just as mean and evil. However, and it's interesting, as it always is when dealing with the Fae, that this particular type of Fae are the protectors of the land and the caretakers of the earth. Extremely powerful nature spirits who are most likely provoked by colonization of any sort that doesn't recognize the Fae and respect the land itself. When the French settlers came into that area, they brought with them their own legends of the Fae. Theirs were called Luton, which actually have their origins in Nordic folklore. However, the French seemed to believe very much in these devious little tricksters who went about playing pranks on the settlers and anyone they could get a good shot at. They disliked humans and even displayed at times some behaviors which we would consider to be similar to the effects of having a poltergeist or noisy spirit in our home. So, suffice to say, these Fae used their magic and enjoyed doing so. They are very mean-spirited and sometimes even downright evil. So, as the French colonized the land there where Detroit is now, and mixed with the natives, these two legends ended up combining. The Europeans came in, and with their own legends of the Fae, which were that these creatures were more than merely mysterious forest entities who played mean-spirited pranks, but rather malevolent harbingers of doom, chaos, and destruction. The founder of Detroit, Antoine de la Mothe Cadillac, on March 10, 1701, decided to throw a party. During the party, as he was greeting his guests, he noticed some people he didn't invite and who definitely weren't dressed for the occasion. One was a woman who looked more like a fortune teller and had a cat on her shoulder. She immediately took his palm and told him that while he was destined to start a great city, it would be a place of much violence and bloodshed for ages to come. The old hag also gave a warning to dear Antoine. Pay homage to and heed the red dwarves, and do not, for any reason, upset them. She went on to explain that to do so would be his downfall. Now, Antoine, being a modern man for his age, didn't believe in such things as fortune tellers, palm readings, and fey creatures, and laughed at the woman and kicked her out of his party. He had her removed quite violently, in fact, and went on about his days without giving even a second thought to her warning about not upsetting the Fae, who were already inhabiting the area he was trying to colonize and turn into the greatest settlement the New World had seen so far. One night, Antoine decided to take one of his mistresses for a walk around his new city. As the couple were walking, they overheard some of the settlers talking amongst themselves and stopped to eavesdrop. The group were talking about how they had seen Les Petits Nains Rouges, or the Little Red Dwarfs, and that they felt the city was now doomed to fail and falter. Once again, Antoine scoffed and was even amused by the stories, which were growing by the day, of the people settling the colony catching sight of these little people, or Fae folk, as we have come to collectively call and know them. Not long after this event, however, Antoine Cadillac himself had his own encounter with what he described as a deformed dwarf-like creature, covered in blackish red fur and possessing beady eyes. The creature's face was fierce and its eyes piercing and blood red. It had crooked and disgusting teeth when it looked at him and sneered. He took a club that was standing nearby and bashed the creature about the head, but it just laughed and ran off. He allegedly had this particular encounter in his own grand home. After this, so the legend has it, Antoine de la Mothe Cadillac lost everything. He died alone and penniless, a ruined man. The city named after him left with a kind of strange curse, just as the old hag fortune teller had predicted. Would Detroit be the same today if he had simply heeded her warning and given respect to the red dwarves? Now, while we'll never know, but it is said that they still roam around the city to this very day, and sightings haven't become more scarce since the 1700s, when Antoine had first envisioned the settlement. These self-same creatures, or perhaps one of the same species anyway, who look exactly the same, was seen that same year repeatedly by a farmer in the area. The farmer alleged that the thing would peer in his windows at night, terrify his family. It would also stalk him as he plowed his fields and tended to his animals. Likewise, his family and young children especially weren't immune to the creature's torment. Another farmer, around the same time, said this same beast-looking thing would stomp on the roof of his barn at all hours of the day, and especially at night, just to rile up the horses and cause the tired family great strife. It would steal his chickens as well. On July 23, 1763, 200 British troops had amassed on the outskirts of the city to surprise a group of native rebels who had defied the post-war policies the British had put into place for the settlers and Native Americans in the area alike. This apparently made them the enemy, and the troops were prepared to surprise attack them during the night while they were unguarded and asleep. This was during the insurgent uprising, which is known to this day as Pontiac's War. This was, of course, named for the fierce leader of the Ottawa tribe, Chief Pontiac. The war that this led to was extremely violent, with the armies on each side killing and attacking innocent civilians on the streets and in the villages, pillaging homes and slaughtering women, infants, and children who had nothing to do with anything and no rights to do with anything even if they wanted to. It was total chaos and bloodshed, and the red dwarfs didn't go without noticing all that blood being spilled on their sacred land. They were seen by hundreds of people during this time, soldiers and Native Americans alike. They were spotted sitting on the banks of a nearby creek where the bloodiest battle took place. This creek, which ran so red with blood, it was still to this day known as Bloody Run, and the little red dwarfs were dancing and celebrating. They were literally laughing and shouting with glee, not rooting for one side or the other, mind you, just reveling in the death and carnage of the war before them. Their demeanor was described as elated and joyous. They were even witnessed dancing amongst the corpses of the dead and swimming in the bloody creek. These little evil creatures were celebrating the bloodshed. Flash forward now, during the Great Detroit Fire of 1805, which burned most of the city to the ground, the red dwarfs were sighted by hundreds of witnesses at that time too. In the days leading up to the fire, they were seen by many witnesses throughout the city, most of whom didn't even know what they were seeing. By the time the 1800s rolled around, most people had forgotten about the city's founder and the warning of the old hag fortune teller. While the disastrous fire was still blazing and people were dying left and right all around, witnesses reported seeing evil little red men dancing around in the flames and on top of the charred corpses. They were seen in the aftermath of the War of 1812 and all the way up into modern times, including the race riots in the 1960s and the extreme desolation and abandoned buildings that occupy Detroit to this day. Now, let's move out of the Motor City and into some more desolate areas of the world and see what other encounters and species we can uncover and perhaps learn a bit about, in case the need should ever arise that we need to be knowledgeable about the FAE and perhaps what to do should we come upon one or several. We should already know that there are thousands of species and hundreds of realms. When a person is kidnapped by a fairy, their fate depends on so many things. We always talk in these videos about the missing in the woods and the FAE's responsibility for such abductions and even the deaths of the missing in question. But what about the people who have come back, that survived? What are their stories like? What do they remember, if anything, about where they were and maybe even why? What happens when the missing end up deceased and people suspect a FAE to be the culprit? How do you explain that to the police? In 1909, a woman in Ireland named Annie McIntyre was abducted by fairies, allegedly, and had quite a story to tell. She was said to have been born on Halloween in 1839, which makes her more prone, some say, to being able to see and possibly interact with many supernatural realms, including those of the Fae folk. She is said to have had a lifelong obsession with, but an immense respect for the Fae. She claims this is because on the night of her birth, she was abducted by the Fae, and had it not been for her brother happening upon the celebrations, she would have most certainly become one of them. No changeling was left behind, and though no one is sure why she was left alone on the night of her birth to be stolen, here's what she claimed until the day she died. On that night of Halloween, in 1839, fairies crept into her home mere minutes after she was born and stole away with her, wrapped in her bedclothes and a small sheet her mother had made for her. As the fairies were bringing her to the nearest circle or portal to one of their realms, they were celebrating, dancing and singing under the moonlight. They were cheering that they had gotten away without being seen, and the couple, who were the ones who would be raising the child, were being hoisted on the other little people's backs. It was a grand celebration while they moved towards the portal. However, Annie's brother was coming back from a friend's house, walking through the woods, and heard the commotion. The flutes and music being played and celebrations happening in the woods right behind his house. He went to investigate and claims he saw dozens of little people carrying off his infant sister, who he knew had just been born that very day. Allegedly, he took his Bible, which he just happened to be carrying, and tossed it right into the group of fairies. They immediately set the infant down and scattered, most of them simply disappearing into thin air. He scooped his baby sister up into his arms and brought her back to the family home. Annie's mother and family were so overjoyed with her return that they had a huge celebration themselves and doted over her, so much as she was almost lost to them forever. There were many precautions set into place that night in that village which have lived on throughout the centuries to assure that babies would no longer be so easily swept up and taken by fairies in the night. Iron bars being hung above the crib itself being made entirely of iron, pinning the infant's nightclothes to the pillow or mattress of the crib, sprinkling the child with holy water before bed and throughout the day if they should be left alone for even a second. There were so many ways thought of to protect infants and children back then from a Fae abduction. Now, these precautions didn't always work, though, but for the most part, they did, or at least they seemed to. Maybe it would be wise for those of us in modern times who believe in and have respect for such things to take notice of and heed the warnings and advice of preventative measures. Instead, though, we buy cute little kits to build our own fairy gardens and set elf totems on a shelf at Christmas time, which, unbeknownst to most people, only provokes the elemental spirits and invites them into your home to do you even more harm. Aside from the brownie species of the Fae, we have yet to find another who is inherently good and not known for any evil intentions or ill will toward the human race, who has plowed down their homes in the forest and disrespected them by portraying them as goofy little scantily clad women flying around sprinkling magic into little kids' eyes just to play with them, or men just to daze and seduce them. Maybe we should give them more credit and be more wise in their ways. Then maybe they'll stop abducting not only our children, but our hunters, our campers, our hikers, our sightseers, from the beautiful and majestic lands and national parks and national forests that the Fae folk guard so tightly and try so hard to keep us from destroying. Well, there you have it, folks. What do you think about these Fae people? I know many people that readily believe in UFOs and Bigfoot will kind of giggle at you if you mention the Fae, but if you look deep enough into the Fae, you'll find that Bigfoot-type elementals and men from the stars in flying vehicles were also told in Fae encounters as well, centuries ago. I look forward to reading your comments, but please keep it friendly and respect each other's opinions. Meanwhile, be good to yourselves and each other. I'll see you just a little farther on down the trail. I'm Steve Stockton, and I'll talk to you next time.